It was a bitter winter night in Missoula, Montana. Snowflakes drifted through the air like ashes from a dying fire, carried by a wind that cut through every layer of clothing. Behind the old bar called the Iron Horse, a narrow alley stretched into the dark brick walls, lined with rusted pipes, dumpsters overflowing with stale beer cans and frozen trash. And in that alley, something was happening. Eddie Malone stumbled out of the bar, drunk and angry, with a steel pipe in his hand. His boots crunched the ice as he muttered curses under his breath, his eyes bloodshot. Wild searched for a target, and he found one. In the far corner, curled against the brick, lay a German shepherd. His coat, once thick and proud, was patchy and matted with blood. His ribs pressed sharply against his skin, his breath shallow and ragged. His name was Shadow, but Eddie Malone didn't care about names. To him, Shadow was nothing but a broken dog, something weaker than himself that he could take his anger out on. Malone lifted the pipe, his shadow stretching long against the alley wall. Shadow whimpered, a low sound of fear, curling tighter against the cold bricks. His body remembered the discipline of training, power he once carried as a canine officer. But tonight there was no strength left to fight back. Malone sneered. Worthless mutt, he spat, raising the pipe higher. On the street just outside the alley, a couple passed by. They slowed, hearing the sound of metal scraping brick, the sharp yelp of a dog in pain. For a moment, they looked down the alley. Their eyes caught the scene, the man, the weapon, the bleeding animal, and then they looked away. The man put his arm around his wife, pulling her along. They didn't want trouble. They didn't want to get involved. That's how it usually went in this town. People saw, people turned away. Malone gripped the pipe with both hands now, ready to bring it crashing down onto Shadow's skull. The dog trembled, waiting for the blow, but someone else was watching. At the far end of the alley, half hidden by the shadows of an old fire escape, stood Jack Reynolds. His breath rose in clouds of steam as he stood, observing. Jack wasn't just another bystander. He was a man who had seen violence before, real violence, the kind that scars your mind long after the bruises fade. A retired Marine, Jack had served overseas in Iraq and Afghanistan. He'd lost brothers on the battlefield. He'd seen both the best and the worst of humanity. And now, standing in this frozen alley in Montana, he saw something that looked all too familiar. Cruelty, unchecked and unchallenged. Jack's fists clenched inside his coat pockets. Part of him whispered to walk away, to let the cops handle it, to not add one more confrontation to a life already full of them. After all, he wasn't young anymore. His knees ached in the cold. His body carried too many old injuries to fight drunk men in back alleys. But then he looked at the dog. Shadow's eyes met his for just a moment. They were tired, dim with pain, but still carrying something Jack recognized. It was the same look he'd seen in the eyes of soldiers holding on in the middle of chaos. A look that said, "Don't leave me here, not like this." Malone's voice broke the silence. "This is it, Mutt. Say goodbye." The steel pipe lifted high, catching the faint glow of the bar's neon sign. Jack stepped forward. One boot crunched loudly on the ice. Malone froze, turning his head. His drunken eyes narrowed at the tall figure emerging from the shadows. "The hell you want, old man?" he growled. Jack didn't answer right away. He just kept walking, slow and steady, his eyes locked on the man with the pipe. He wasn't holding a weapon. He didn't need one. The weight in his stare carried enough history, enough battle-tested authority, to make even a drunk man hesitate. The alley went silent, except for the whistle of the winter wind. Shadow let out a weak, trembling breath. Jack stopped a few feet away, his voice calm but sharp as a knife. "Put it down." For a moment, Malone laughed, a rough, broken laugh that echoed off the brick walls. "You don't tell me what to do," he said, tightening his grip on the pipe. "This mutt's mine. I'll do what I damn well please." Jack didn't move, didn't blink. Not tonight. The words hung heavy in the air. Behind Malone, a few more people had gathered at the mouth of the alley, their faces pale in the cold, their eyes wide as they realized what was happening. But none of them stepped forward, not yet. They watched, waiting to see if the man in the shadows would do what they couldn't. Malone's lip curled into a snarl. He raised the pipe higher again, daring Jack to stop him. And in that split second, standing in the freezing dark of a forgotten alley, Jack Reynolds made his choice. He would not turn away. Jack Reynolds wasn't just another face in the crowd. He wasn't one of those people who looked down the alley, felt uncomfortable, and kept walking. He was different, though. He didn't always see that as a good thing. Jack was a Marine, retired now, years out of uniform. But the title never really leaves you. It's stitched into your bones. He had served in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in places most people only heard about on the evening news. He'd carried rifles through deserts, kicked down doors in hostile cities, and watched friends take their last breaths in the dust. And now, here he was back in Montana, in a town that didn't know his name, standing in a dirty alley with snow in his hair and a drunk man ready to kill a dog. Jack lived alone these days, a cabin just outside of Missoula tucked against the tree line. No wife, no kids, just him and the silence. He liked it that way, or at least, he told himself he did. The truth was harder, nights were long, the silence wasn't peaceful, it was heavy, it pressed against him, bringing back the sounds he could never escape. Gunfire, explosions, the cries of men calling for help he couldn't give. PTSD wasn't a word Jack liked to use, but it lived with him. It was in the way he startled at sudden noises, in the way he scanned every room, every crowd, searching for threats, in the way he avoided people because he didn't trust what he might say or what memories they might stir. The shadows had become his comfort zone. Darkness meant no one was watching, no one was asking questions. But that night, standing in that alley, the shadows forced him to watch. He saw the dog, the German shepherd, ribs poking through his skin, his eyes wide with fear. Jack's chest tightened. He'd seen that look before, not in dogs, but in men, in young Marines trapped under fire, begging with their eyes for someone to step in, to do something. And just like on those nights overseas, Jack felt the old question rise inside him. Should I intervene, or should I turn away? He could walk. Nobody knew him here. Nobody would blame him for minding his own business. That's what everyone else was doing. The couple who walked past, the small group of onlookers now gathering at the mouth of the alley, they all had the same calculation in their minds. Not my fight. Jack had told himself those same words before, in the supermarket, at the gas station, when he saw someone being treated unfairly, yelled at, pushed around, he would look away, tell himself he wasn't that man anymore. He wasn't the soldier, the protector, the one running toward the danger. He was tired of that role. It had cost him too much. But looking at Shadow, Jack knew the truth. He could lie to himself all day, but his instincts never changed. And his instincts were screaming at him now. This wasn't just about a dog. This was about who Jack Reynolds was when the world got dark. Malone's laughter echoed through the alley as he raised the pipe higher, taunting the dog like it was a game. Shadow whimpered, pressing himself against the cold brick wall. Jack's hands curled into fists. His heartbeat picked up, not from fear, but from something older, something that had carried him through ambushes and night raids. The muscle memory, courage. He took a step forward. The sound of his boot cracking against the ice snapped through the air. Malone spun around, his drunken eyes narrowing as he spotted Jack emerging from the shadows. Jack didn't rush, he didn't shout, he just kept moving slowly, deliberately, every inch of him calm, controlled, the way Marines are trained to move when the situation turns dangerous. He knew. Malone saw an old man, the gray at his temples, the lines etched deep across his face. But Jack also knew something else. He had been underestimated his whole life, by younger soldiers, by enemies overseas, and now, by a drunk bully with a pipe. Jack's voice came low, steady, the kind of voice that didn't need to be loud to carry weight. "Put it down," Malone sneered, clutching the pipe tighter. "You don't tell me what to do, old man. This ain't your business." Jack stopped just a few feet away. His eyes never left Malone's. It is now, and in that moment, Jack knew he had made his choice. He wasn't going to walk away. He wasn't going to let another living soul be destroyed while he stood in the dark. He was a Marine. He was a fighter. He was a man who still believed that courage meant stepping forward, even when nobody else did. Jack Reynolds took one more step into the cold light of the alley. The fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. The night pressed down heavier now, the cold biting through coats and skin. The narrow alley behind the Iron Horse had become a stage, lit only by the faint flicker of a broken neon sign and the yellow glow of a distant street lamp. Jack Reynolds stood firm, his frame blocking Eddie Malone's path. The Marine in him was still there, even if buried under years of silence and whiskey-stained nights. His posture wasn't just casual, it was calculated, a quiet wall of resistance. Malone sneered, his breath carrying the sour stench of liquor. The iron pipe dangled from his hand like an extension of his rage. "Back off, old man," he spat. "This ain't your business." Jack's eyes didn't waver. They dropped for half a second to Shadow, curled against the brick wall, ribs rising and falling with shallow breaths. Then they locked back onto Malone. "It became my business the second you decided to beat on something that can't fight back." Few people had gathered now, bar patrons who'd followed the commotion, a couple of late-night stragglers drawn by Ray's voices. They lined the edge of the alley, their eyes wide, but their mouths shut. No one moved to stop this. No one ever did. Malone puffed out his chest, swinging the pipe against the wall with a sharp clang that echoed through the alley. You think you can just step in here and play hero? You don't know who you're messing with. Jack's voice was calm, almost a calm. I know exactly who I'm looking at. You coward. Beating a dog to make yourself feel like a man. A ripple went through the crowd. Some shifted uncomfortably, but no one dared speak. Malone's face twisted red. His eyes darted left and right, noticing the onlookers. He didn't like being called out, not in front of others. His hand tightened around the pipe until his knuckles turned white. You don't know a damn thing, Reynolds, he barked. That mutt, this piece of garbage cost me money, time, respect. You think it's some hero. It's nothing but trouble. Jack took one slow step forward. His voice dropped, steady as a hammer hitting steel. That dog pulled men out of fire. It saved lives when men like you were too busy hiding. I know what it is. And I'll tell you what it isn't. It isn't yours to destroy. For a moment, silence. The only sound was the dripping of some unseen gutter pipe and the faint hum of the neon. Shadow lifted his head weakly, one eye catching Jack, as if sensing something shift in the air. Malone let out a sharp laugh, though it cracked with unease. What are you, some kind of saint? Some washed-up soldier looking for a cause? He took a step closer, pipe raised. You don't scare me. Jack's steps didn't change, but his jaw tightened. He had been stared down by insurgents in the dark, by men with rifles aimed at his chest. He knew what fear was, and it didn't look like Eddie Malone. Scaring you isn't the point, Jack said quietly. Stopping you is. The crowd leaned in now, breath held. Some wanted to see a fight. Others silently prayed it wouldn't come to that, but the alley had become too small for both men's pride. Malone snarled, spittle flying. You're a fool. You don't walk into another man's fight. Jack's reply was a whisper that cut sharper than a shout. It's not a fight when only one side can bleed. The words landed heavy. For a split second, Malone hesitated, his grip loosened, his eyes flicking to the bystanders. Their faces weren't cheering him on, they were watching, judging. And then pride took over. His roar broke the tension like a gunshot. He lunged, pipe swinging wide toward Jack's head. The crowd gasped, the sound rising like a tide. Some backed away, others froze in place. Jack moved, not with panic, but with the reflexes of a man who'd lived 100 nights like this before. His arm shot up, deflecting the pipe off his forearm with a dull thud. Pain shot through him, but he didn't flinch. He stepped into Malone's swing, closing the distance. Locking eyes with him so close Malone could smell the steel of determination in Jack's breath. The alley was no longer just a backdrop. It was a battlefield now, and everyone knew it, for the first time that night. Shadow raised his head fully, a faint growl rumbling from his chest, as if even the broken dog recognized that someone was finally fighting back. The crowd was silent, strung tight between fear and awe, and then, with a furious snarl, Malone pulled back, ready to strike again. But Jack Reynolds didn't move. He simply stood his ground. A man unwilling to let the darkness take one more victim. The night was about to break wide open. The pipe swung down again. This time Jack caught it with both hands, the metal clanging against bone. Pain shot up his arm, sharp and electric. But he held on. Malone cursed, wrenching the weapon free, and drove his shoulder into Jack's chest. The old Marine stumbled back, boots scraping against the wet pavement. His breath came heavy now, the years weighing on him in ways no training could erase. But instinct, that old unbreakable instinct, kept him upright. Malone pressed forward, wild and sloppy, throwing swings meant to break more than bone. Jack ducked, blocked, shifted just enough to stay standing. Each hit he absorbed reminded him he wasn't 20 anymore. His body screamed, but his mind was calm. This wasn't just some bar fight. It was another battlefield. And he'd been here before. Malone roared, swinging the pipe in a wide arc. Jack leaned back, felt the wind of it brush past his face. His boot came up, driving hard into Malone's knee. The bigger man grunted, staggering for a moment, but didn't fall. The crowd flinched with every strike, the air thick with tension. A couple of cell phones rose, their screens glowing like blue beacons in the dark, but most still stood frozen, trapped between fear and conscience. Jack's chest burned, his fists were heavy now, every movement slower than it used to be. Malone saw it. He grinned through blood-stained teeth, confidence flaring. You're done, old man, he snarled, raising the pipe high for the finishing blow. And that's when a voice cut through the night. Stop! It wasn't loud at first, but sharp enough to snap heads toward the alley entrance. A woman stood there, dark hair pulled back, scrubs under her coat. Emily Carter. She was off shift, just walking home. But her voice carried the authority of someone who had spent too many nights holding lives in her hands. Enough, she shouted again, stepping closer, her eyes locked on Malone. You'll kill him if you don't stop. The words struck harder than Jack's fists ever could. For the first time, the crowd stirred. A couple of people edged forward, no longer just spectators, phones lifted higher. Recording. A man muttered, "She's right." Another added, "This has gone too far." Malone froze mid-swing, pipe still raised, his chest heaving. His eyes darted between Emily and the crowd. The control he'd held, the fear he'd fed on, was slipping. Jack, bruised and breathing hard, straightened his stance. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. The shift in the air said enough. Emily took another step forward, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "Put it down, Malone, right now. Everyone's watching." The glow of cameras grew brighter. The once silent crowd now had weeds. Whispers spread like sparks, igniting courage in places it hadn't lived before. Someone called out, "Yeah, put it down." Another voice joined in, louder this time. "Leave him alone." Malone's grip faltered. Sweat streaked down his face, mixing with rage and humiliation. He had always counted on silence, on people turning away, but silence was breaking. Jack's eyes never left him. "You hear that, Malone? You're not the only one in this alley anymore." For a heartbeat, no one moved. The pipe hung in the air like a pendulum deciding which way to swing. Then Malone growled, teeth bared, "You think they'll save you?" His words were desperate now, spit flying. "They're sheep, always have been, always will be." But even as he said it, the crowd edged closer. 3 men stepped forward. A woman raised her phone higher, steadying it with both hands. The balance had shifted, and Malone knew it. Emily's voice cut through again, calm but unyielding. "Walk away, Eddie. This doesn't end the way you think it does." Jack braced himself, ready for another lunge. His body ached, his vision blurred at the edges, but his spirit was steel. He'd hold the line if he had to. And then it happened. A man from the crowd, mid-30s, leather jacket, still smelling of beer, stepped right into the alley. His voice shook, but it was loud. "She's right. Walk away." Malone, another joined him, then another. One spark had become a flame. Malone's chest heaved, rage burning hotter with each second. But his audience, the one he'd relied on to look away, had turned. They weren't his anymore. The weight of their eyes crushed down on him heavier than Jack's fists ever could. His scream tore through the night, raw and gutter. He hurled the pipe against the wall, metal clattering against brick, and shoved past the edge of the crowd. People flinched but didn't part as quickly as they once would have. Jack stood still, every muscle shaking with the aftermath. He exhaled, slow, steady, watching Malone's shadow disappear into the darkness. Emily rushed forward, kneeling by Shadow first, her hands gentle as she checked the dog's breathing. Then she looked up at Jack. "You okay?" Jack nodded, though his body begged to collapse. His voice was rough, but steady. "But been worse." The crowd lingered, murmurs rippling like aftershocks. But something had changed in that alley. For once, fear hadn't won. And as Jack watched Emily cradle the wounded dog, he realized the fire that had sparked here tonight wasn't going out anytime soon. The pipe still echoed where it had struck brick, the sound fading into the cold Montana night. The alley was no longer silent. There were voices now, sharp, angry, alive. Malone's shadow was swallowed by the crowd as 2 officers pushed through, hands on their holsters. "Eddie Malone." One of them balked, the big man twisted, still fuming. But the fight had drained out of him. He wasn't a monster anymore, just a drunk cornered in the mess he had made. The cops pinned him against the wall, his curses drowned out by the metallic snap of handcuffs. For Jack, though, the noise blurred into nothing. His eyes were fixed on Shadow. The dog lay crumpled in the corner, chest rising shallow, fur matted with blood. Jack knelt slowly, joints stiff and sore from the fight. Emily was already there, her hands moving with practiced urgency. "He's fading," she whispered, her palm pressed against the shepherd's ribs. "Heartbeat's weak, but he's holding on." Jack pulled off his coat, laying it across the animal's body. The blood seeped through quick, soaking into the fabric, into his hands, into his memory. He gathered the dog carefully, lifting him against his chest. Shadow's weight felt heavier than any rucksack Jack had ever carried in war. The shepherd's head lolled against his shoulder. Jack could hear the faint rasp of breath against his ear, a sound that clawed at something deep inside him, because this wasn't just any wounded dog. In his mind, the alley dissolved. He was back in Fallujah, dogged, smoke and fire all around. AK-9 named Ranger, jet black like Shadow, lunged into chaos, dragging Jack clear of shrapnel that would have torn him in half. Ranger had taken the hit instead. Jack remembered cradling him, much like this, feeling the life bleed out as medics screamed for stretches. That same helpless weight pressed down on him now. Emily touched Jack's arm. "We need to move him. There's a clinic 2 blocks away I can call ahead." Jack nodded, throat tight. His boots carried him forward before his mind caught up, each step deliberate, as if the ground itself demanded respect for the life in his arms. The crowd parted this time, no longer silent, no longer looking away. They watched, some with phones still raised, others with tears or shame in their eyes, but they made space. Jack didn't look at them. His focus was Shadow. Behind him, Malone's voice rang out as the cops dragged him away. "It's just a damn mutt. You'll see it ain't worth it." The word stabbed, but Jack didn't flinch. He tightened his hold instead. Shadow whimpered, weak but real. That sound, that fragile fight for breath, was all the answer Malone would ever deserve. The night air bit harder as Jack stepped out of the alley. Snowflakes drifted in the glow of the streetlights, soft and unforgiving all at once. Shadows blood-stained, the white flakes where they landed, red blooming against white like battlefield snow Jack had seen overseas. Emily kept pace beside him, her phone pressed to her ear. "Yes, we're coming in severe trauma, XK9, multiple lacerations. Be ready." Her voice, steady as steel, carried the urgency Jack couldn't find words for. He shifted Shadow gently, adjusting the dog's head so he could breathe easier. "Hang on, soldier," Jack muttered, voice low, meant only for Shadow. "You've been through worse." "I know you have." The dog stirred faintly at the sound, as if recognizing the cadence of a comrade's voice. By the time they reached Emily's car, Jack's arms burned from the strain, but he refused to let go. Emily opened the back door, spreading her coat over the seat, and together they laid Shadow down. Jack's hands lingered on the shepherd's side, feeling the fragile rhythm of life still fighting to stay. It took him back again, those last moments with Ranger, when every breath had felt like a borrowed miracle. This time, maybe he could tip the balance. Emily's hand landed on his shoulder. "He's got a chance," she said quietly, "but we have to move now." Jack slid into the passenger seat as Emily started the engine. Sirens wailed faintly in the distance, maybe for Malone, maybe for something else, but Jack only heard the ragged sound of Shadow's breathing. He stared out the window as the car rolled through empty winter streets. Neon lights blurred past, bars still buzzing with music and laughter. People who had no idea what battles were being fought just a few blocks away. Jack's voice was almost a prayer when he whispered, "You're not dying in some alley, not like that. Not tonight." The car surged forward, headlights carving through the cold, and in that fragile in-between between despair and hope, between life and death, Jack Reynolds held onto a single truth. He wasn't carrying just a wounded dog. He was carrying a brother in arms, and he would not let him go. The little Subaru tore down the frozen streets of Helena, its headlights carving tunnels through falling snow. Emily gripped the wheel with both hands, her knuckles white. Jack sat hunched in the passenger seat, one hand pressed to Shadow's side, feeling each ragged breath as if he could will the dog's lungs to keep moving. Shadow whimpered softly, eyes half-lidded, chest barely rising. The smell of blood filled the car, metallic and sharp, mixing with a faint trace of antiseptic from Emily's scrubs. "Stay with me, soldier," Jack whispered, his voice hoarse. "You're not done yet." Emily glanced over. "Clinic's up ahead, just hold on." The sign for Helena Veterinary Care flickered as they pulled into the lot, a small, one-story building tucked between a shuttered diner and a laundromat. At this hour the place looked deserted. Emily jumped out first, banging on the glass door, until the lights inside flickered on. An older man appeared, a vet in his 50s, gray at the temples, pulling on a coat over his scrubs. He unlocked the door, confusion creasing his face until he saw Shadow in Jack's arms. "Good Lord," he muttered. "Bring him in." Inside, the clinic smelled faintly of bleach and dog shampoo. Jack laid Shadow on a metal exam table, his hands reluctant to let go. The dog's fur was slick with blood, paws twitching weakly. The vet doctor, Harris, snapped on gloves. Moving quickly now, he checked Shadow's vitals, lifted an eyelid, pressed fingers against his ribs. His frown deepened. "These wounds are severe. Internal bleeding, possible skull trauma. He's gonna need more than stitches." He hesitated, voice dropping lower. "And it won't be cheap. Blood transfusions. Surgery, we're talking thousands." Jack stiffened. The words cut deep, heavier than any blow Malone had thrown. Emily opened her mouth to argue, but Dr. Harris raised a hand. "I'm not saying I won't try, but if you can't cover it." The door burst open. A young man from the alley stumbled in, still holding his phone. "Doc, I saw everything. That dog saved lives. People are already talking. He pulled out a crumpled wad of bills, slapping it on the counter. This is what I've got. Use it. Behind him, an older woman shuffled in with a coffee tin full of coins. For the shepherd, she said, setting it down. One by one, more faces appeared. People who had stood frozen in that alley now moved with purpose. A mechanic in grease-stained overalls handed over a folded check. A waitress dropped tips, still smelling of fries and beer. Someone muttered about calling friends, posting online, raising whatever they could. And then came the most unexpected. A tall man with a leash in hand, his golden retriever padded at his side. He can donate blood, the man said firmly. He's a match for most shepherds. Do it. The clinic filled with voices, money, and movement. What had been a sterile, lonely space was now alive with urgency and something else, something like redemption. Emily touched Jack's arm, her eyes shining. See, they're stepping up. Jack looked around the room, stunned. Minutes ago, these people had stood in silence. Now they dug into pockets, wallets, even their pets, giving whatever they had. He felt the sting in his eyes, the kind he used to hide on deployments. Dr. Harris exhaled, nodding. All right, let's get to work. Emily snapped into action beside him, helping prep equipment. The retriever was guided into another room. The sound of machines came to life. Monitors, pumps, tools clattering on trays. Jack stayed by Shadow's side, his hand never leaving the dog's paw. The shepherd's breathing was shallow, but it was there. Harris worked with steady precision, Emily assisting. Each cut of scissors, each press of cause, felt like a beat in the race against time. Jack leaned close, whispering again, though his voice shook. I've been here before, buddy. I've held the line while someone I loved bled out. Not again. Not you. The memory of Ranger clawed at him. The battlefield roar, the final gasp. Jack pushed it down, forcing himself into the present. This wasn't Fallujah. This was Helena. And maybe, just maybe, this time would be different. Hours stretched like years. The waiting room had turned into a makeshift camp. People dozed in chairs, others paced, some prayed quietly. The sound of coins dropping into jars and the buzz of a phone alerting to another donation online filled the silence. Through it all, Jack sat unmoving, holding Shadow's paw like a lifeline. His other hand rested against the scar on his own arm, the one Ranger had once pulled him from. Tonight, that scar burned like fire. Finally, Dr. Harris stepped out, pulling off his gloves, sweat on his brow. The room fell silent. He's not out of the woods, the vet said, voice heavy but steady. But the surgery went as well as it could have. If the transfusion holds, he's got a chance. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Relief. Hope. Something fragile but real. Emily leaned against the wall, eyes closed, whispering a quiet thank you. Jack's shoulders sagged, exhaustion finally breaking through. He looked back at the door to the operating room. Shadow was still in there, still fighting. And for the first time that night, Jack believed, maybe, just maybe, the fight wasn't lost. The clinic was quiet now. The chaos of surgery had faded into the low hum of machines and the faint shuffle of Dr. Harris moving behind closed doors. The waiting room lights glowed soft and yellow, casting long shadows on the linoleum floor. Jack sat slouched in a chair, elbows on his knees, Shadow's blood still dried on his shirt. Emily sat across from him, her scrubs wrinkled, her hair pulled loose from its tie. Between them stretched a silence, heavy with exhaustion, but also with something else, hope clinging to the edges of fatigue. Jack rubbed his hands together slowly, staring at the floor. His voice was low when it came. You ever work with dogs overseas? Emily shook her head. Only here. Strays, rescues, sometimes farm animals. Why? Jack leaned back, eyes drifting toward the ceiling as if the memories were written up there. I served with them, K9 units. Shepherds mostly. Smart, steady, braver than most men I knew. He paused, jaw heartening. I watched one take a bullet meant for a Marine. He didn't hesitate. Just did his job. Saved a life. Then he was gone before we could even get a medic on him. Emily's gaze softened. She had seen the way Jack held Shadow earlier, like he was holding something far more than flesh and bone. You lost him. Yeah, Jack said quietly. Ranger, black ship, looked a hell of a lot like Shadow. His voice cracked just slightly, but he steadied it. When I saw Malone swing that pipe, it wasn't just some drunk beating a dog. It was like watching it all happen again. And I couldn't. He shook his head. I couldn't let history repeat. Emily leaned forward, elbows resting on her knees. That's not history repeating, Jack. That's you stopping it this time. For a while, they let the silence stretch again. The hum of the vending machine filled the space. along with the muffled sound of a dog barking somewhere deeper in the clinic. Emily's eyes drifted toward the operating room doors. You know, I've seen too much of this. People hurting animals because they can, because no one will stop them. You call the cops, maybe they show up, maybe they don't. Most folks just look away, pretend it isn't happening. Jack studied her. But you didn't tonight. She gave a weary smile. Neither did you, Jack exhaled. Leaning back deeper into the chair, his body ached, but his chest felt lighter than it had in years. Feels strange, doesn't it? Doing something that actually matters. Emily nodded. Feels right. Outside, snow tapped gently against the clinic windows. The town was sleeping, unaware of the small battle being fought inside these walls. But for Jack, this night felt bigger than any fight he'd ever lived through. Because this one wasn't about survival. It was about redemption. Emily broke the silence again. You think he'll make it? Jack's gaze lingered on the door to the operating room. I don't know, he admitted, but I know this, he's not fighting alone anymore. That's more than I can say for a lot of battles I've seen. Emily smiled faintly at that, though her eyes carried the same worry Jack felt. The minutes stretched, the nights dragging on. Every sound made Jack's pulse jump. Footsteps, the squeak of a gurney, the faint creak of pipes. Time inched forward like a slow march. At one point, Emily handed Jack a paper cup of stale coffee from the vending machine. He took it, sipping without complaint, the bitterness grounding him. They didn't talk much after that. Words felt heavy, and silence said enough. Jack's mind drifted. He thought of Ranger again, of the weight of his sacrifice, of the scar it left, and he thought of Shadow, lying on the other side of that door, carrying not just wounds but the burden of trust in people who had failed him once. Jack clenched his jaw. Not this time. The door finally swung open. Dr. Harris stepped out, mask dangling around his neck, his eyes tired but steady. He glanced at them both, then offered the faintest of nods. He's stable, still critical, but stable. Emily exhaled, shoulders slumping in relief. Jack closed his eyes for a moment, whispering something under his breath, a thank you. Maybe a prayer, Harris added. He'll need monitoring through the night. He's not out of danger, but he's got fight in him, more than I expected. Jack rose slowly, joints stiff, but his back straight. So do we, Jock, he said quietly. The long night was far from over, but hope, thin, fragile, stubborn, had survived with him. Morning came with a cold gray sky. The storm had passed, but the air still felt heavy, like the town itself was holding its breath. Malone was in handcuffs. The local police had dragged him out of that alley, his shirt stained, his eyes wild with anger and alcohol. But even behind bars, Malone carried the smugness of a man who believed the system would protect him. By noon, word spread through the small town like wildfire. People whispered at diners, murmured at gas stations, shared the story over church parking lots. Did you hear about Malone? He nearly killed that shepherd, and Jack, the vet, Emily, they stopped him. It didn't take long for the controversy to follow. At the courthouse 2 days later, Malone appeared in a wrinkled suit, his wrists free now, his lawyer walking beside him with polished shoes and a practiced smile. The lawyer's voice carried the tone of someone who'd said it all before. Ladies and gentlemen, this is not a case about violence, he argued. This is about an animal, a dog, not a person. My client may have overreacted, yes, but we cannot let emotions cloud the law. It's property damage, at most, nothing more. Jack sat in the back of the courtroom, fists clenched. The words hit like bullets. Just a dog. Emily leaned closer, whispering, "Stay calm. We'll have our turn." The judge's gavel tapped for order. The hearing continued. Witnesses were called. A neighbor described hearing the yelps, the sound of metal striking bone. Another testified how Shadow had been chained up for days, left without food or water. When Jack finally took the stand, the room shifted. He wasn't a man of polished speeches, but his voice carried weight, the kind forged in battlefields and long nights of silence. "I've served with dogs," he said, looking the judge straight in the eye. "I've watched them run into gunfire to protect men like me. I've seen them save lives without hesitation, and I've seen them die for it. To call Shadow just a dog is to deny the truth. He's a life, a partner, a being that feels pain, loyalty, fear, and he deserves justice." The courtroom was still. Even the lawyer didn't interrupt. Emily testified next, her voice trembling with both nerves and conviction. She spoke of the nights she had treated broken animals in secret, knowing the law rarely punished those responsible. "If we let this slide," she said, "what message do we send? That cruelty has no cost. That life doesn't matter unless it speaks our language." Reporters scribbled furiously, cameras clicked. By evening, the local paper ran a headline across its front page: "Justice for Shadow, Town Divided Over Animal Cruelty Case." The article lit a fire under the community. Some stood firmly behind Jack and Emily, rallying for stronger protections. Donations poured into the clinic, messages of support taped to its door, but others scoffed, muttering in diners that people are making too much fuss over a mutt. The debate spilled onto radio shows, into Sunday sermons, even onto the schoolyard. Children whispered about Shadow like he was a hero. Old-timers shook their heads, saying they'd seen worse and nothing ever changed. But something was changing, for the first time in years. Malone looked smaller, not because of the law, but because the town itself was watching him, judging him. His name, once muttered with caution, now carried shame. Jack knew the outcome was uncertain. The law had loopholes, and Malone's lawyer knew every one of them, but in his gut, Jack felt something he hadn't in a long time: resolve. That night, back at the clinic, Jack sat by Shadow's side. The shepherd's breathing was still shallow, but steadier. His bandaged body rose and fell with each fragile breath. Jack spoke softly, not sure if Shadow could hear. "They'll try to say you don't matter, that what was done to you isn't worth fighting for, but they're wrong. You matter more than they'll ever understand, and I won't let them forget it." Emily stepped in quietly, setting down a fresh blanket. She met Jack's eyes. "Tomorrow won't be easy." Jack nodded. War never is, but for once, he wasn't marching into it alone. The first sign came in the stillness of early morning. Jack had dozed off in the chair beside Shadow's kennel, his head tilted forward, arms crossed over his chest. The faint scrape of claws against metal pulled him awake. Shadow's eyes were open. For a moment, Jack thought he was still dreaming. The shepherd's gaze was unfocused. Glassy was pain, but alive. The dog shifted, a weak tremor running through his frame as though even breathing was a burden. Jack leaned forward, his voice low and steady. "Easy, boy. You're safe now." But Shadow flinched. The moment Jack's hand hovered near the bars, the shepherd jerked back, pressing into the corner. His body shook, tail tucked tight. The memory of steel and fists lingered in his bones. Jack froze, withdrawing his hand slowly. He understood. He'd seen that look before on men fresh from battle. Eyes darting, shoulders tight, waiting for the next blow. Trauma didn't vanish just because the fight was over. Emily entered quietly, carrying a tray of fresh bandages and a bowl of water. She paused when she saw Shadow awake. "That's a good sign," she whispered. "He made it through the worst." Jack nodded but kept his eyes on the dog. Surviving's one thing, trusting again that's another. The next few hours were measured in inches. Jack sat near the kennel, his movements slow, deliberate. He didn't reach for Shadow again, just stayed there, talking in that calm, gravelly voice. Stories about the Marines, about the desert, about a dog named Ranger who once dragged him out of gunfire. At first, Shadow didn't respond. His ears twitched, but his body stayed rigid. Every muscle coiled in fear. But midday, Jack placed a small piece of chicken just inside the bars and leaned back. It didn't move, didn't urge. Minutes stretched. Finally, Shadow's nose twitched. Hunger wrestled with fear. He crept forward, shaking, and snatched the meat before retreating. Jack almost smiled. Almost. "That's it, soldier." Baby steps. Over the next days, progress came in fragile victories. Shadow would eat if Jack sat nearby. He would drink if Emily was quiet and gentle in her movements. Every flinch, every glance over his shoulder reminded them how deep the wounds ran. But slowly, something began to shift. One evening, as rain tapped against the clinic's windows, Jack slid a hand just inside the kennel without a word. He didn't move, didn't push. Shadow sniffed the air, eyes wary. For long minutes, nothing happened. Then, cautiously, the dog lowered his head and let Jack's fingers brush his fur. The contact was brief, but it was a beginning. Emily watched from the doorway, her arms folded. She saw the way Jack's whole body softened in that moment, the way Shadow's trembling eased. "He trusts you," she said quietly. Jack shook his head. "Not yet, but he wants to. That's enough." Days turned into a week. Each interaction chipped away at the fear. Jack fed him by hand, one bite at the time. He sat through the night when Shadow whimpered in restless dreams. Sometimes, Jack spoke. Sometimes, he just breathed steady so the dog could match his rhythm. Emily found herself studying Jack as much as the shepherd. She noticed the patience etched in his features, the tenderness buried beneath the scars of a soldier. The man who once lived alone in shadows was now coaxing another soul out of them. The turning point came on a quiet morning. Jack opened the kennel door, crouched low, and waited. For a long while, Shadow stayed inside, torn between fear and longing. Then, with halting steps, He crossed the threshold and pressed his muzzle into Jack's palm. Jack swallowed hard, linking against the sting in his eyes. He scratched gently behind Shadow's ears. "Good boy," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Good, brave boy." Emily smiled from across the room. She didn't need to say anything. The sight spoke louder than words. The broken animal was beginning to heal, and so was the man beside him. For the first time since the alley, Shadow's tail moved just a faint wag, but enough to light the room. And in that small clinic, beneath the weight of all they had endured, hope stirred like a flame refusing to die. The clinic smelled of antiseptic and wet fur, the kind of scent that clung to clothes and skin long after you left. Shadow's wounds were healing, stitched and bandaged, but the deeper scars, the ones that lived in muscle and memory, would take longer. Emily had set aside a small corner of the exam room for his recovery. A mat lay on the floor, soft enough to cushion his weight but firm enough to let him test his strength. The first time they coaxed him out to walk, Shadow's legs buckled after only a few steps. Jack crouched beside him, steady hands hovering near but never forcing. "Easy, boy," one foot in front of the other. "Just like training." Shadow wobbled, his paws sliding against the linoleum. His body trembled under the effort, ribs rising and falling in sharp, shallow breaths. For a second, Jack thought he might collapse, but then something sparked in those amber eyes, something stubborn, familiar. The dog steadied himself. Jack's chest tightened. He remembered another time, another place, the blistering heat of the desert. The grueling drills that pushed men to their breaking point. He remembered dragging himself up from the dirt with every bone in his body screaming to stay down. And he remembered a canine partner ranger nudging him forward, refusing to let him quit. Now, years later, Jack found himself in the opposite role. "You got this, soldier," he whispered, his voice roar. "Just keep moving." Emily stood nearby, watching, her eyes wide with quiet hope. She'd seen animals fight to survive, but rarely with this kind of determination. Shadow wasn't just walking, he was reclaiming something that had been stolen from him. Step by shaky step, Shadow made it across the room. By the time he reached Jack's waiting hands, his legs gave out and he slumped into the man's lap. Jack caught him gently, holding his weight as though the shepherd was something fragile, sacred. The room was silent, except for the sound of Shadow's panting. Then Emily let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. A smile spread across her face. "He did it," she whispered. Jack stroked the dog's head, his calloused fingers brushing through coarse fur. "Yeah, he did." Over the next days of progress came in small victories. Shadow stood longer, walked farther. Each stumble was followed by a pause, a breath, and another attempt. The determination in his movements stirred something deep inside Jack, a reminder that survival wasn't about strength alone, but about the will to keep trying. One afternoon, Emily brought in a handful of townsfolk who had been following Shadow's story. They crowded into the small clinic, faces eager, some holding out treats, others just there to witness. Jack hesitated at first, too many eyes. Too much pressure, but Emily's quiet nod reassured him. This wasn't about performance. It was about community, about letting people see the resilience they had fought to save. Shadow stood on trembling legs in the center of the room. Jack knelt a few feet away, palm outstretched. "Come on, boy. Just one more step." For a moment, the room held its breath. Shadow wavered, his back legs shaking violently. Then, gathering what little strength he had, he pushed forward, one step, then another, and another. When he reached Jack, the shepherd's body sagged into his chest, but his tail wagged weakly, uncertain but real. The room erupted. Applause, cheers, a few tears quickly brushed away. Strangers clapped each other on the back. Emily's eyes shone with pride. Jack looked down at the dog pressed against him, his voice thick with emotion. "You're tougher than most men I've ever served with." As the noise settled, Jack realized something. Shadow's fight wasn't just about healing from abuse, it was about reclaiming trust. Each step he took wasn't just a victory over fear, it was proof that broken warriors, man or beast, could learn to stand again. That night, after everyone had gone, Jack lingered in the dim light of the clinic. Shadow lay curled beside him, breathing steady in sleep. Jack leaned back against the wall, his mind turning over the day's events. He thought of his own nights in the barracks, trying to drown out the screams that echoed long after the battlefield went quiet. He thought of the moments he nearly gave up, nearly disappeared into silence. And he thought of the one constant that had pulled him back each time, a sense of duty. The belief that no matter how broken you felt, you didn't fight alone. Looking down at Shadow, Jack realized they shared that bond now. Both scarred, both survivors, both learning, step by step, to trust the world again. He reached out, resting a hand lightly on the dog's shoulder. "We're the same, you and me, two old soldiers finding our way back." Shadow stirred in his sleep, pressing closer. For the first time in years, Jack allowed himself a small, unguarded smile. The war wasn't over for either of them, but in that quiet room, surrounded by the echoes of applause and the warmth of renewed trust, Jack knew they were both learning how to live again. It started with a single article in the Helena Gazette, a small column buried between local sports and weather updates. The headline was simple: "Veteran, Community Save Abused Canine," but simple stories have a way of catching fire. Within days, photos of Shadow bandaged but standing spread across social media. Clips from the alley, shaky cell phone footage of Jack facing down Eddie Malone, began circulating online. The comments flooded in. "That dog's a hero. This town needs more men like Jack Reynolds. We can't stay silent anymore." Helena, Montana, was a small town. Word traveled fast, and soon, it wasn't just words, it was action. Emily was the first to suggest it. She walked into the clinic one morning, eyes lit with a kind of fire that refused to be ignored. "We should hold an event," she told Jack. "Not just for Shadow, for every animal that's been through what he has. People need a way to do more than clap from the sidelines." Jack had shrugged at first. "I'm no organizer. I'm barely holding my own life together," but Emily only smiled. "That's the point. You showed people it's okay to stand up. Now they want to follow your lead." And so it began. Flyers went up around town. "Community fundraiser against animal cruelty. All proceeds to local shelters and Shadow's recovery fund." Local businesses pitched and bakers donated pies. Mechanics offered free oil changes as raffle prizes. The high school gym opened its doors for the event. On the day of the fundraiser, Jack expected a modest turnout, maybe a few dozen faces. Instead, the gym filled wall-to-wall families, teenagers, old-timers who hadn't been seen in years. Some brought dogs on leashes. Others carried signs with handwritten messages. "Protect the voiceless, no more silence." Jack stood near the back, overwhelmed. He wasn't used to crowds anymore. For years, he'd lived in the shadows, convinced the world had forgotten him. Yet here they were, hundreds of people, not just showing up, but rallying for something bigger than themselves. Emily nudged his arm. "You should say something." He shook his head instantly. "I'm no speaker. Doesn't matter. Just tell the truth." So when the microphone was handed to him, Jack's hands trembled. The room quieted, all eyes turning his way. He cleared his throat, searching for words. "I didn't plan on being here," he began. His voice was low, rough around the edges, but steady. "That night in the alley I just saw something I couldn't walk away from. And truth be told, I almost did. I almost let someone else handle it. But then I thought about the men I served with, about the dog that once pulled me out of gunfire, and I realized silence doesn't save anyone, action does." He glanced down at Shadow, lying near the stage, stitches still visible but eyes bright, tail thumping against the floor. "This dog is alive because people here chose courage over comfort. You didn't look away, and I think if we keep choosing that, together, there's no telling how much good we can do." For a beat, the gym was silent. Then the applause came thunderous, rolling, rising like a wave that seemed to lift the whole building. Jack stepped back, overwhelmed. He wasn't a hero. He was just a man who couldn't stay quiet anymore. But in that moment, he saw it clearly. Courage was contagious. The ripple effect spread beyond the gym. Donations poured in. The shelter received enough funding to expand. Volunteers signed up in record numbers, and, perhaps most importantly, ordinary people who once walked past suffering with lowered eyes began to find their voices. Jack noticed it in small moments. The grocery clerk telling him she'd reported a neglected horse down the road. A teenager who stopped him on the street to say he'd stood up for a stray being kicked at school. Little ripples, spreading outward. One evening, Emily found Jack sitting outside the clinic, Shadow resting at his feet. The night was crisp, the stars bright. She lowered herself beside him. "How does it feel?" she asked. He tilted his head, puzzled. "How does what feel? To be respected again, to be seen." Jack was quiet for a long moment. Then he exhaled, the breath carrying years of solitude with it. "It's strange," he admitted. "I thought I was done mattering to anyone." But maybe he looked down at Shadow, who leaned against his leg, warm and steady. "Maybe I was wrong." Emily smiled softly. "Sometimes the world forgets. Sometimes it remembers. You reminded it." And in that small town, under a wide Montana sky, Jack Reynolds realized something he hadn't believed in years. Forgotten men and broken dogs could still spark hope strong enough to move a community. The ripple had begun, and it was only growing stronger. The gavel came down with a heavy thud that echoed through the county courthouse. For the first time in weeks, Jack felt like he could breathe again. Malone, the man who had once seemed untouchable in the back alleys and shadows of the town, now stood defeated in front of the law. The sentence was clear: fines, probation, and most importantly a permanent ban from owning or working with animals ever again. It wasn't the longest sentence in the book, but it was enough. Enough to make sure Shadow would never feel that man's hand again. Jack sat in the back of the courtroom, Shadow's leash wrapped loosely in his hand. The shepherd's fur was growing back, his scars less raw now, but his body still carried the memory of what had been done to him. Shadow's ears flicked at the sound of the judge's words, but he didn't tremble. He pressed against Jack's leg instead, leaning into him like a child clinging to a parent. Jack placed a hand on his head and whispered, "It's over, buddy. It's fine, Yova." Emily stood beside them, arms folded but her eyes bright with quiet satisfaction. She had seen too many cases slip through the cracks, too many animals written off as just dogs. This time was different. This time, justice had reached even the darkest corner of their little town. In the weeks that followed, paperwork turned into reality. Jack became Shadow's official guardian. The adoption was more than a formality, it was a promise sealed in ink and intention. When Jack signed the papers, Shadow sat beside him, tail thumping on the shelter's linoleum floor, as if he somehow understood that his wandering days were over. The shelter staff clapped and hugged Jack, but his eyes missed it, not from their applause, but from the weight of what it all meant. He had spent years after leaving the military believing he was too broken to start over, too fractured to deserve another bond. But now, as Shadow licked his hand and pressed against him with loyalty born from pain and survival, Jack felt something inside himself begin to knit back together. "Guess it's official now," he murmured to Shadow. "We're a family." Emily's fire hadn't dimmed either. She poured her energy into starting a rescue fund, rallying volunteers, and reaching out to local businesses. What began as a small community effort soon gained momentum. Flyers popped up in coffee shops and grocery stores. Local news stations gave airtime to the cause. Donations trickled in, then poured. The fund became more than money. It was a movement, a statement that cruelty would no longer be ignored. Jack never sought the spotlight, but he couldn't avoid it either. People shook his hand in diners, thanked him at the gas station, nodded at him in the street. Veterans especially seemed drawn to him, seeing in his story and Shadow's recovery a reflection of their own battles. For the first time since coming home, Jack didn't feel invisible. He felt needed. Still, he remained humble. At every event, when people praised him, he would gesture to Shadow and say, "Don't thank me, thank him. He's the real fighter here." Winter deepened, and snow covered the town in white silence. On one of those mornings, Jack woke before dawn. The world outside was still, the air sharp and clear. He whistled softly, and Shadow padded over, ears perked and tail wagging, ready for whatever lay ahead. Together, they stepped out into the cold. The snow crunched under Jack's boots while Shadow bounded ahead, nose buried in powder, then circled back to walk at his side. The street was empty, save for the two of them, but the horizon carried a faint glow. As they reached the end of the road, the sun began to rise. The first rays of light stretched across the snow, turning the white landscape into gold. Shadow stopped, lifted his head, and let out a small bark that echoed in the stillness, sharp, alive, triumphant. Jack paused, his breath fogging in the cold air. The sight struck him with a force he hadn't expected. Years of war, years of loss, and months of doubt seemed to melt away under that sunrise. Shadow stood tall beside him, no longer the trembling, battered creature he had first pulled from an alley. And Jack, though his body still carried scars and his nights still carried shadows, felt a strength he hadn't known in years. He realized then, they weren't just survivors. They were warriors who had found a reason to fight again. Jack reached down, rubbed behind Shadow's ears, and whispered, "We made it, didn't we?" The shepherd leaned into him, tail wagging, eyes bright as if to say, "Yes, we made it." And as the sun climbed higher, painting the snow in fire and light, man and dog walked forward together, two souls scarred by the past but reborn in the dawn of a new day.